One of the goals of fiction is to generate an emotional response in the audience, and one of the ways this is accomplished is by having major events happen to the characters in the story. They move homes, they get a new job, they get sick, they fall in love, they go to war, they have a child, they lose a loved one. When these things happen to the character, they will feel a certain way about it, and assuming the character is well written, the audience will also feel a certain way about it. The only limit to what can happen is in the imagination of the writer. But there is one subject that makes people extremely uncomfortable, and that subject is assault, and not the physical kind. People have a visceral reaction to it, even more than things like mutilation, genocide, or any other horrifically violent scenario you could imagine. Well, today, I'm gonna argue why it's not only a valid element of fiction, but show that in some instances, it can enhance the story by its very nature. Now, before I really get into the meat of the argument, I do need to address a small but vocal minority that I know will be making their presence known in the comments. There is a fringe belief out there that media that contains sexual assault is fundamentally immoral, and those who create it or consume it must be apologists for that behavior in the real world. That if you enjoy any story in which a character gets raped, you must believe that rape is good. Most of you watching this will intrinsically understand that this only makes sense if you don't think about it, but I'll quickly explain for those of you who haven't quite caught up yet. I believe that sexual violence in fiction is acceptable for the same reasons I believe that physical violence in fiction is acceptable. It's not real. We rightly laugh at the Jack Thompson wannabes who say that Doom or Mortal Kombat or Grand Theft Auto will cause people to commit mass violence, because we know that when somebody gets hurt or killed in a video game, no violence actually happened. And there have been studies on the connection between video game violence and real-world violence, and they overwhelmingly fail to even prove a correlation. I would argue that the same is true of sexual violence in fiction as well. And anecdotally, I've actually noticed an inverse correlation between the family friendliness of a piece of media and how well adjusted its fans are. If you're going to argue that media containing sexual assault is only made or consumed by dangerous people, I'm gonna need more justification than, dude, trust me. And if you can't accept that fictional sexual assault isn't real, you're probably 12 years old, in which case you shouldn't be watching my videos anyway. So here's how the rest of this video is gonna go. Rather than talk about the topic purely as an abstract concept, I'm going to showcase a few direct examples. For those new to my channel, I primarily make reviews and critiques of visual novels and similar media. Visual novels are text-based stories, but they have accompanying music and visuals, and will sometimes include things like dialogue choices and gameplay elements. But one interesting facet about visual novels is that they evolved out of the Japanese porn games of the 80s and 90s, which means that even though visual novels are not inherently pornographic, and there are many that don't include any sexual content whatsoever, it's not uncommon for visual novels, even the ones that are serious artistic and literary works, to have explicit sex scenes. What this means for this video is that when a visual novel contains sexual assault, it's often not just included, but actively depicted, which turns every aspect of it up a notch. I'm going to talk about 3 pieces of media today that all contain sexual assault, but all handle it differently. First will be Euphoria, the visual novel, not the 2019 TV show. Next will be the Sayano Uta visual novel, and last will be the Rance game series. Don't worry if you don't know one or more of these, I'll explain the necessary bits as we go. With that, let's begin. Euphoria is a psychological horror visual novel. I'm showing footage of the absolutely terrible hentai adaptation, but I'll be talking about the VN, that has a cryptic and layered plot meant to be uncovered bit by bit as you replay it to get all the different endings. The premise is that the protagonist Keisuke has woken up in a mysterious facility alongside several of his classmates and his teacher. In order to escape, they must complete a series of trials, all of which involve Keisuke being forced to do various things of an extreme sexual nature to the others. Failure or refusal means death, and not a quick one. To complicate matters further, Keisuke has a fetish for this kind of thing. Don't get me wrong, he's not a bad person. He has a functioning conscience, and he's fully aware that acting on these desires would be wrong, so he suppresses them in his day-to-day life with no real issues aside from a bit of shame for having these thoughts in the first place. But now he's in a situation where he's forced to engage in that behavior, and the two halves of his mind are in conflict with one another. He has a visceral enjoyment when doing the trials, but once finished, he hates himself for it. And to make matters worse, one of his classmates, Nemu, is constantly provoking him and actively attempting to make him embrace his dark side. While this is far from the only conflict, much of the story outside the true route hinges on the question of will Keisuke remain himself, or will he succumb to his demons? And the sex scenes in Euphoria are mostly very extreme and deliberately so. And by the very nature of them being threatened with death, all participants are in fact sexual assault victims. The thing that a lot of people fail to realize about Euphoria is that it's meant to make you uncomfortable. The extreme nature of the scenes highlights the contrasting nature of the story. On the one hand, we get to see Keisuke's personality in its extreme form in contrast to how he is when he's in normal guy mode. He goes from being a pretty standard kind of high school protagonist to someone who has been completely overcome by his lizard brain and acts like a monster. Will he get through this with his humanity intact, or will he let this newfound situation completely take him over? There are endings depicting both, and they all feed into this overarching dynamic. And there's another contrast between Keisuke and the reader. As mentioned before, you're supposed to be uncomfortable during these scenes, and the fact that Keisuke is showing his sadistic side is also meant to make you very uncomfortable. Now, it's true that some adult games and visual novels, particularly a lot of Nukige, will kinda lighten the mood in their sex scenes and will avoid showing all the negative consequences of the more extreme or less consensual acts, or in some cases, those negative consequences don't even exist in the context of that fictional universe. But Euphoria does give these scenes a level of gravitas that you don't see in most visual novels with this level of sexual content. To repeat what was said earlier, Euphoria is a psychological horror, and much of that horror comes from seeing how such an extreme level of stress and trauma can affect our cast of characters. So the average reader will not have Keisuke's reactions to those scenes. Keisuke always has this manic glee and his partners are always visibly distressed, even though most of them are willing to endure the trials because they know that this is just what needs to be done. And in fact, two of them derive either pleasure or satisfaction from the situation for reasons that are a bit spoilery. But even they look like they're close to breaking during the scenes. These are real characters with real motivations, and with the exception of the soft antagonist Nemu, the typical reader doesn't want them to suffer. So having the protagonist's emotional response conflict with the viewer's emotional response serves as a dissonance to amplify the entire tone of "this is really messed up." And then in the second half of the non-true routes, Keisuke is put into more of a submissive role, as the antagonist of that section puts him and those around them through things that are even more twisted than in the beginning. And while these scenes are also meant to make you uncomfortable, it does so for a different reason. I can't even describe some of the things that happen in this section without potentially running into TOS issues, and I actually had a physical reaction to one of them, which I didn't even think could happen at the time, since it's pretty hard for fiction to rock me. But this section is meant to make you have a visceral reaction to just how far the antagonist is willing to go and just how evil they can be. The goal is to make this antagonist into a brutal and overpowering presence that puts more and more pressure on Keisuke's psyche as the ordeal goes on. And it also actually serves a dual purpose, as the true ending makes you think about the entire story in a different way, which completely recontextualizes the things that are happening and adds another crazy layer to things. Which does tie into the whole "you're meant to be uncomfortable" thing. But that can't be discussed without spoiling things, and if you can handle it, Euphoria really should be on your reading list. So that's the first use of sexual assault in fiction, as a cudgel to bash the audience over the head. The next thing I want to talk about is the visual novel Saya no Uta. Unfortunately, some mild to moderate spoilers are necessary in this section, nothing that should ruin your experience with it, but the first big reveal alongside two major events that happen later in the story will have to be spoiled. If you want to avoid this, that's completely understandable, so you can use this timestamp or the chapters down below. Saya no Uta is a Lovecraftian homage written by Gen Urobuchi, most known for his work on Madoka Magica, Psycho Pass, and Fate Zero. The premise is that the protagonist Fuminori was in a terrible accident that took his parents' lives and left him severely injured. The doctors save his life, but he sustains brain damage that alters his perception of the world. The world around him looks all fleshy and pulsating. The people look like monsters. The food tastes disgusting. It basically looks and feels like he's in hell, and he has an uncontrollable, visceral disdain for the people around him, even though he knows it's not logical. But he meets one person who looks normal to him, the titular Saya. Only issue is, as revealed not too far into the story, she's not human. She just looks that way to Fuminori due to his brain damage. She's an alien who pretty much functions as an eldritch horror, and she ends up forming a codependent bond and a romantic relationship with Fuminori. I've already talked about Saya no Uta in multiple videos now, but the gist of what the story is going for is a showcase of how Fuminori slowly rejects his humanity and slips further and further into insanity via a series of events that each push him just a bit more towards his ultimate fall. In Saya no Uta, there are two sexual assault scenes, and rather than sharing Euphoria's aim, which is basically to fuck with the reader, here the goal is entirely about utilizing the disturbing nature of the act to shape Fuminori's character. The first scene pushes him over a major moral line, and the second shows him at the point of no return. The context for the first scene is that Saya is kind of lonely and wants to see if she can make new friends. So she goes to Fuminori's neighbor and messes with his brain so that he has the same condition as Fuminori. This process drives him insane, and after a few crazy person things, including killing his own family, they look like monsters to him, he runs into Saya, who tries to introduce herself, except the dude is way too far gone and he forces himself on her. Fuminori walks in on this, and for context, he's already crossed multiple moral lines and started withdrawing from society. Naturally, he's none too thrilled about seeing what looks to be a monster assaulting his lover, and in a rage he, for the first time, takes a human life. Saya no Uta is structured around these big moments where Fuminori is pushed into doing something he normally wouldn't do, and they mark a shift in the overall tone and in Fuminori's sanity. And naturally, these only escalate as time goes on, with each one pushing his boundaries just a bit more. Taking a life was a big step. Granted, I'd argue that he was completely justified in this scenario, but it's still no small thing to kill someone. And I think it was deliberate that it was something as extreme, as vile as a sexual assault to make him overcome with emotion so that he can do something so impactful. The second scene is much later in the story after Fuminori has become pretty despicable, eating the flesh of humans that Saya had killed, attempted premeditated murder, you name it. So at this point, Saya decides she wants to do something nice for Fuminori. So she abducts a girl named Yo. Yo was a part of Fuminori's friend group from before his accident, and it's strongly implied that they would have ended up together had things been different. After taking her, Saya proceeds to mutate and warp her body into a horrifying abomination, breaking her mind in the process. This allowed Fuminori to look at her and perceive her as her original form. The two then proceed to make her into their plaything. Let me try to frame this moment for a bit. At the start of the story, Fuminori already had an aversion to people. He viewed them as monsters, and even though he knew it wasn't real, he couldn't help but hate them. He could tolerate their presence for a while, but would isolate himself as much as possible. But he was still in control of himself, and at worst he was a bit rude at times. But he slowly kept getting worse and worse. He became less willing to keep up the facade of normalcy. He stopped caring about how his actions affected anyone but himself and Saya. Then at one point he screams at Yo and says many cruel things to her so that he would hurt her badly enough that she would leave him alone. This is someone he cared about at one point. And when he and Saya ruthlessly abuse her while she's already in constant suffering due to her transformation, at that point the reader is slapped in the face with a hard truth. Fuminori is completely gone and there is no turning back. The assault scene is horrific and evil, and that's the point. It's meant to be so intense that you know there is no good left in him and he has fully fallen into darkness. Up until that point, you could kind of understand most of his actions. Even eating human flesh is contextualized as it being the one thing that doesn't taste disgusting to him, so it was hard to refuse. But not this, especially since he no longer viewed Yo as a monster. She looked exactly like the person he had known for years and had cared about. He didn't have that visceral hatred when he looked at her, but he no longer needed it to completely dehumanize her. That is what this scene is for, and it would be extremely difficult to get that same visceral impact without something as terrible and brutal as sexual assault. And because it was so awful, it really served as great character work. And that's the second use of sexual assault in fiction. A tool for shaping a character's personality and actions through extreme and traumatic events. Ready for a bit of a tonal shift? The last piece of media I'm going to cover today handles the topic very differently. Rance is a series of adult games that spanned from 1989 to 2018. It was a pretty big hit and inspired titles such as Nekopara and Mushoku Tensei. Yes, really. And its finale, Rance 10 Showdown, currently holds the record for the longest script of any video game ever, clocking in at roughly 3.8 million Japanese characters. It hasn't released in English yet. Rance started out as a pure parody of fantasy RPGs. Remember that this was 1989, right around the time the earliest Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest games were releasing. The main gimmick is that instead of a valiant hero fighting for the weak, the titular Rance is a narcissistic, horny asshole who thinks he's a valiant and noble hero. The series would eventually escape the realm of pure parody and develop a real fleshed-out story, though it did keep its comedic roots and it also kept Rance's assholery, and the fact that he always wants sex and isn't particularly concerned with whether or not the women around him also want sex. Yeah, the Rance series is one of the biggest examples of an okay, hear me out kind of game. But yes, Rance commits sexual assault quite a few times and it is often played up for laughs. That admittedly sounds really fucked up, but the way it's presented to the player softens the edges up quite a lot. Rance often leans into ridiculous, absurdist humor. Rance once yelled at the sun for daring to shine in his eyes while he's sleepy. At one point he tried to sleep with a ghost, but when he jumped on her, he went right through and crashed into the floor. He once accidentally nuked a sentient alien race into extinction. He cured an epidemic with his dick. The events of Rance 4 happened because he just casually pissed off God himself about halfway through the previous game. While Rance does have a serious story from 3 onward, it is at its core extremely goofy, and it's clear that many scenes are basically in silly mode. So we have to realize that sexual assault in the Rance universe doesn't function the same as it does in the real world, or how it's depicted in most other fictional works. In this context, it's basically the sexual equivalent of Wile E. Coyote having an anvil dropped on his head after falling off a cliff. In the real world, he'd be a smear on the ground, but in context it becomes a mild annoyance to him at worst. Same thing with the sexual assault in Rance. In the real world, it's a horrifying and traumatic thing that destroys lives, but in the Rance universe, it just isn't for the most part. It's an upsetting thing, sure, but Rance's victims always get over it remarkably quickly, and often the only lasting impact is that they're just kinda pissed at him. So when Rance delivers the Hammer of Justice, his words not mine, to the main antagonist of the first game, the player's first thought isn't, oh, this is horrible and disturbing, and instead they're able to fully embrace the absurdity of this subversive take on the hero triumphing over the villain. In Rance, the extreme nature of sexual assault is not used as a source of horror or trauma like the other titles I talked about today, but as a source of absurdity. We don't think, oh no, how awful, because we know the girl's gonna be fine. It allows us to laugh at how out of pocket Rance is being, and how crazy it is that when confronting ruthless, powerful, and evil villains, his first instinct is often to boink them. Although interestingly, there are times when sexual assault is not done as a pure joke in the Rance games. In these instances, it's mostly used to amplify the evil factor of an antagonist. See, the thing about Rance the character is that yes, he is very rapey, but his goal is not to necessarily cause suffering. He is purely out for his own gratification, and the desires of the people around him simply don't factor into his calculations. Hell, in Rance 4, one of the women he meets shares his proclivities, and they end up working together, as it were. At one point, Rance actually reins her in and tells her that she's going too far with one of their victims. When she goes past the point of wanting to make herself feel good and into the realm of wanting to make someone else feel bad, Rance gets uncomfortable and puts a stop to it. So he has lines. So when a villain commits a sexual assault, it's almost always framed in a twisted and sadistic way. For example, the antagonists of Rance 2 were 4 mages who had become possessed by cursed magical rings and were forced to do evil things. One of them would kidnap women and do some pretty messed up things to them that were not treated lightly by the game. One minor antagonist in Rance 6 was obsessed with tracking down one of the side characters and killing her, and he raised his daughter to be extremely powerful so that she could do what he was growing too old for. And part of that process involved transferring his magical power to her through sexual abuse, which the game treats as horrifying, and it even causes the person she was trying to kill to forgive her and feel sorry for her. One of the side quests in Rance 6 was all about destroying a brothel that caters to clients who, let's just say they prefer youthful workers, and Rance himself is full of righteous fury upon learning that one of the camp had at one point been trafficked to that location. So despite being a comedic series that does make light of sexual assault, it's also capable of treating it seriously, and it's actually quite impressive that they're able to have these two elements coexist without breaking the player's immersion. And honestly, I think both uses of sexual assault are able to enhance their respective tones. And that's the third use of sexual assault in fiction. A means of delivering absurdist comedy, and as a means of making a villain that much more evil. So to be clear, I'm obviously not saying that sexual assault is a good thing. Of course not. But what I am saying is that it does have legitimate artistic value in the context of fiction writing. Not only is it a thing that people actually experience, which I think on its own would be enough justification to include it in fiction, but it elicits intense and visceral reactions that are difficult to achieve through other means. When used properly, the extreme nature of sexual assault can be used to enhance the tone of a story, as a defining moment in a character's arc, as a means of showcasing an unredeemably evil villain, or in some cases, making a scene so absurd that you can't help but laugh. George Carlin had an excellent take on that last one.
Like rape, they'll say, you can't joke about rape. Rape's not funny. I say, fuck you, I think it's hilarious. How do you like that? I can prove to you that rape is funny. Picture Porky Pig raping Elmer Fudd.
So yeah, as uncomfortable a topic as it is, sexual assault does have real value in art, and I think it's high time we all stop being so outraged when people write about it. Thanks for watching. Big thank you to my members, especially my $10 members Bulk Squat Thrust and President Irina Vladimirovna Putina. If you want to join them in supporting the channel and get early access to future videos for as little as $1 a month, hit the join button down below. And let's be real here, I'm probably not making any money on this video, so that would be appreciated. But if that's not your thing, liking and subscribing is free and it does actually help me out. And of course, I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts in the comments section down below. Well, once again, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time. Play the electro swing.
Hit the road, Jack, and don't you come back no more, no more, no more.